Hi, David. How are you?
Hello. Good. How are you?
Thank you for joining us on our podcast. So,
Pleasure.
for today, we just kind of wanted to know about your experiences with the work. So, to get us started, if you could talk about your experiences and kind of your journey with gender-based violence, and then we can get into the specifics afterwards.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I count myself as lucky that it's not something that I really encountered until I was a young adult. Um, in the world, it wasn't part of my upbringing, and I've gone back in my memory um, since encountering it and kind of, thought about the households that I was in as a kid, and the parents and things like that. Because, when you're a kid and you go to other kids' houses, you're watching the parents and every house has its own vibe, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I honestly don't recall um, any signs or clues that would have led to that, right? So, I've been pretty privileged to not encounter it until later on. I mean, I think the kind of, models of masculinity that I was raised into through my father and his friends were, especially for people of their age, I mean, these were the boomers, right? And the kind of the older folks in my neighborhood were the World War II era, right? And there were a lot of problems with people coming back after World War II, as men and women tried to fit into the new roles in the new post-World War II, at post-World War II world. There was a lot of that. I didn't see any of that, and masculinity, the model that I kind of grew up with was one of, pretty much kind of respect, like you don't hurt people, you support them. So I was pretty privileged. Where it kind of came into my life was my first academic job was and I've talked about this in class, like um, in where Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri all meet, kind of out in the Western Plains, I guess. And uh, my wife at the time was a social worker at a shelter. And this was a shelter that had kind of two missions. One side was substance abuse treatment, and the other side was domestic violence. And one of the things that I learned about quickly through her work was that the interrelationship, unfortunately, between the two sides, and there's good reasons why they had those two things together. Um, and I met some of the women at the shelter through, they would have kind of fundraiser, this and that, and hearing kind of stories about the place. And my wife would tell me her experiences, at work in a general sense. And it just kind of, over time started to dawn on me like, wait a minute, this, like, what's going on in these houses is like what I read about happening in prisons, like, and what I hear about happening in conflict zones in terms of torture, right? And it just kind of was this, huh, this is torture. Like these women are being tortured, in their relationships. Um, and then there was a time when my wife, called me and she said, can you take the dog out this afternoon? And I'm like, sure, why? And she's like, well, we're all sheltered in place because there's a guy here with a gun looking for me. She was the caseworker assigned to a woman whose male partner, had decided that she'd been taken away from him, right? This is the possessive thing, right? And he came to the shelter with a pistol, wandering through looking for her, because he was going to get his, his female partner back. And I learned that this was not a novel experience, that this was something that happened, um, not all the time, but it wasn't, unknown. And when it's your own, spouse, it just it just hits you different, right? Like when it enters your own life, the violence enters your own life, it's different, right? And that was the game changer for me. It's like, wow, this bled into my own life. And then there was the experience of she was a rape victim advocate. And so a lot of times, like she'd have to go to a hospital in the middle of the night to go with a client and make sure that a rape kit was administered and that the police were doing what they were doing. And where we lived, as you might expect, was very rural. So it was like a 40-minute drive to one of the hospitals that was used quite a bit. And she hated to drive, so I would drive, right? So I'd get up with her and go. And so I learned about this, and then you can't help, seeing what's going on. And I think you have a choice when you're exposed to things like that it makes an impact on you or it doesn't, right? It made a big impact on me. And I felt that like a lot of people come to the realization, wow, you know, there's a lot of human rights violations right here at home. They're every bit as terrible as the torture I read about happening abroad that makes the Amnesty International's report or something like that. And it just was a real kind of coming coming to reality, situation for me, and it was making connections. And the other thing that really led me down the line of looking at kind of law and domestic violence was she would often go to court as a court advocate for her clients, right? So they would go and there'd be a hearing for maybe an order of protection or something like that. And she would go to court. And one time she came home and was really agitated. And I said, "Oh, what happened today?" And she's like, "Well, I'm mad at the judge." I'm like, "Well, what did they do?" And she said, "Well, my client was there and the judge granted an order of protection. And we asked for staggered removal. And staggered removal is something that happens a lot of times in kind of contentious custody cases. And it is that like one party to the proceeding will the leave the court grounds first, right? And then once they're gone, then the other party leaves. It's to kind of separate them, prevent kind of uh, violence or fighting. And it's pretty common. And so she said that we asked for staggered removal, and the judge said no. And she said we pointed out that this is just something like you just gave an order of protection for this woman, right? And now you want her to like kind of walk out of the building with this guy, at the same time. That's not a great idea, and she said the judge was a woman, and she said, "I'm not going to have my bailiff tied up, you know, leaving the courtroom, to protect your client because, it's going to tie up my courtroom and it's going to make me late." And I said, well, isn't there some sort of rule where like they have to do that? That makes so much sense that to just stagger the removal. And she said, no. And I was really taken aback because I was super naive, right? I was super naive, about the process. And I thought, huh, well, like there ought to be a law, right? And then I was like, I wonder what other laws that would make a whole lot of sense we don't have. So that really is kind of where I, started wondering about these things. And I thought, well, okay, well, I'm a social scientist, like I'm really concerned about this. I feel terrible for these women, and I can tell stories about law. So that's what I'm going to investigate. And that's really kind of what, you know, pushed me down this road, just kind of that experience in my own life. And I think maybe if, my spouse at the time doesn't take that job, I skip on merrily through life, like blissfully ignorant, like I was before, but I didn't. And so it became kind of a commitment to be kept.
Is
What,
you can go.
like,
Um, that was really interesting. The way your wife brought you in, you didn't mean to see these things, but you did.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that that's how this goes for a lot of us. where we don't mean for this to happen. But like you said, when it's in your life, it's very different. I wanted to ask you about two things. One, I want you to talk a little bit about your work since then and how that has inspired your work today. Um, and then I also want to talk about, you mentioned torture so many times. I know that you teach a torture class,
Yeah.
and I'd love to hear more about that, as it relates to gender-based violence.
Yeah. I mean, I think, if you're interested in human rights, I think people who are interested in human rights, maybe have a more difficult time not being able to unsee certain things, right? Once you've seen it, you don't let it go, right? Which is a blessing and a curse, right? I know that y'all are interested in kind of like what happens from the question list that y'all have sent me, what happens when you are triggered or something like that. Taking care of yourself's very important, and that's really, part of having a lifestyle where it's hard to unsee stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, you don't unsee it, and it resonates, continues to resonate. I mean, where it pushed me, so I was known for human rights data, right? Creating human rights data. I had come up with something when I was a graduate student that resonated kind of with policymakers globally. And so I thought, well, I've got this perch, right, where I have the privilege of having conversations with big actors about states and their human rights respect, that, maybe I can use that perch to bring onto the conversation these stories, database stories about gender violence. And I hit upon a statistic, right? I was looking at a UN report called Progress of the World's Women, and I saw a statistic that said 67% of countries have a domestic violence law. And I thought, wow, that's a terrible statistic, because law is not yes or no, right? Laws can be great, laws can be terrible, helpful, detailed. They can be designed not to be used, right, in certain cases. So I thought, wow, I mean, the truth has to be more complicated than that. So let's maybe not be crediting countries who aren't doing really well by saying, hey, they have a law, that's great. So I went through their data, and I found a bunch of countries that I thought were questionable calls. And UN Women was kind enough to have a meeting with me, and also one of my UConn students who was working with me, Celia Giard at the time. And we went to New York and met with them, and I brought a bunch of sheets of questions and questionable calls in their data set. And after quite a while sitting there, they finally said, like, yes, even countries that have a discriminatory law get a one, like they have a law, right? And the reason for that had not with the ethic of the people working there. It wasn't necessarily something that they wanted to do, but their organization as a creature within the UN and the mission to serve the interests of the member states kind of forced them into that position. And that's a long political story behind that. But I thought to myself, like, well, I don't work for the member states. I can tell whatever story I want. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go through, I'm going to find out what the laws are like in the countries around the world, which was, again, super naive, because I had no idea what kind of work I was facing down. Having made data for a long time, I'm like, no problem, I can do this. I make data every year. 7 years later, I had 4 years worth of data, and I was working with a student of mine, Jillian Hagland, who's at the University of Kentucky now. And it took forever to gather these laws and to come up with a scheme to assess these laws, and I got a lot of great feedback along the way from a lot of actors, a lot of diplomats and stuff about how we should phrase things. And it brought me into the orbit of Rashida Manjoo, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women from 2009 to 2015. And I had put an article in the Washington Post about what I found about violence laws. And she had read it, and she said, well, you know, I'm going to be in New York. Why don't you come up and talk? And so I went and talked to her, and we found that we had kind of this common belief that, you know, the CEDAW Treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, doesn't really address violence in a binding law kind of way, and that there needs to be kind of a binding treaty on that. And so we remained in contact and did some things together, and, you know, as part of an edited book. And she had me write a little bit of a report for the UN Human Rights Council on the legal situation in the countries. And like, she brought me into the orbit of a lot of other people that are working on the subject, which drew me into this organization, Every Woman Everywhere, who was kind of going for a treaty on a standalone treaty on gender violence. And, you know, I got kind of pulled into this movement. And so it's kind of the way that I think a lot of people's work lives are. Once you get put into a channel, you know, you keep getting pulled by the gravitational forces of other actors, you know, and they keep you somewhat in that orbit. You know, so right now, actually, I am working talking with a company that does a lot of work in, they're working in, I think they're in like 4 developed countries right now, developing countries. And they do kind of technological access for people in those countries that typically don't have it. And we're looking at ways to kind of help you know, women tell their own stories. One of the problems I've had with the data on women's rights is that there are people like me who decide these are the data we should have, and then we go and collect it, right? And it seems to be a rather top-down approach, and it's something that I felt should swing the other way, right? I mean, we should have conversations with victims and social workers and lawyers and ask them what are the stories that need to be told, and then kind of engineer it from that way, right? I'm kind of the technocrat, like I'm here to help them tell their story in a reliable way. You know, so we've been kind of talking about that. So I think that inversion is one important thing that's going to happen. I mean, the other thing is through the apps that this company does. We can ask them these questions, you know, have them talk about their experiences in a way that's, you know, a lot cheaper, because surveys and things like that are enormously expensive. A lot more green, because it would really reduce the amount of travel that people need to do surveys abroad. And it'll increase the ability to kind of respond to events in a very, very quick way, you know. And this company has a kind of a low carbon footprint cloud technology. I don't understand it, but it sounds really cool. Like, you know, so, you know, that's kind of what I've kind of been doing lately, in that space. I could go on and talk about torture forever. I can. You know, it rolls into torture because, you know, there's been a lot of movement internationally in the last 25 years about, or even more, about looking at, particularly rape gets mentioned the most as torture, right? And, you know, rape has been looked at as torture in times of conflict, as a tool of conflict for a long time. But now it's coming around looking at just kind of, you know, I hate to say regular rape, but rape outside of a conflict zone, you know, rape in private households during a time of peace, familial rape, if you want to think about it that way, interpartner rape, stranger rape. You know, and so, I mean, as Yola, I think, has seen in class, you know, the behavior in terms of the abuse, it's no different, you know, if you kick somebody down the stairs because they're a woman, or if you kick somebody down the stairs because they're a prisoner, right? I mean, what happens to them, the physical degradation and the degradation to their dignity, is identical, right? You know, if somebody rapes a woman because they're a woman, or somebody, you know, rapes them because they want to extract information, what's the difference in the, you know, the degradation to their dignity, right? So, I mean, I think folks like me look at those identically. And so I do, I use a torture lens to view sexual violence in and out of conflict. And again, I think it's increasingly accepted by legal experts. And, it's part of a state's obligation to make sure that private actors aren't violating human rights in the state's territory. So I do use that lens quite a bit.
Just going off of that, one of the questions that we usually ask is for participants to define gender-based violence. And we kind of, Anthony and I did this like the first episode that we had, what it means to us, and kind of making it clear that this is still an expansive definition, because obviously as the world progresses and as more information we have, the better definition can be suited for it. Especially curious because you mentioned this like torture element. So I'm curious to see how your definition of gender-based violence has been impacted by torture and if it has been impacted at all.
Well, I mean, I define it really simply, and actually the word because is the key word. It's violence that is perpetrated because of someone's gender, right? And so, in human rights law, like for example, in the UNCAT that we've been talking about in class, there's a list of enumerated purposes for something to qualify as torture: obtaining information, obtaining a confession, and so forth. Whereas gender-based violence, right, is violence not for any of those purposes, but strictly because that person has this identity, right? I mean, there isn't an enumerated purpose of discrimination, and I think that it overlaps there, right? Because, perpetrating violence against somebody because of their identity is a form of discrimination. And that jives with kind of general comment 19 on CEDAW. But so I define it very simply is that, and it, like I said, it is perfectly compatible with my view of torture. For me, torture is it's about the degradation to someone's mental or physical integrity, and it's not about the reason why you do it. It's not about where you do it. It's about degrading someone's physical and mental integrity intentionally, right? Or at least doing it through an act that you could reasonably foresee that this would be the consequence. And so I really have come to a place where I see no difference between a husband committing violence on his wife and a security personnel committing violence on a prisoner.
What do you think is the significance of correlating or conceptualizing gender-based violence in forms of torture, the way that you view it as, that they're the same thing, essentially? What do you think is the significance of that? And it can be an academic level, like, or an international legal level.
I think it's simple. I think it's labeling, the power of labeling, right? Labels are powerful, right? For good and for bad. We all know that. We've all dealt with labels in our lives, right? Or seen what labels do, right? And people understand torture. They understand the power of that word, right? Torture has a connotation to it that is extremely powerful. States will, again, like the United States, will admit to enhanced interrogation, but we don't torture, right? Because they know the T word is awful, right? And it's a no-go, And so when you equate something with the worst thing possible, you put it in terms that people understand, right? I think a lot of people don't understand gender-based violence. I mean, particularly, the word gender these days is very politically charged, right? And like you look at Judith Butler's new book, right? Who's Afraid of Gender, right? It's very politically charged. But if you just put on puts and I think it's easier for people to understand the dynamic of what's going on, right? Because torture is a dynamic of the intentional infliction of despair, right? For me, I think it's, yeah, there's pain, but when you look at people who've suffered it in the way they talk about it, to me, the kind of thing that comes across is despair. They might get over the physical pain, but the despair and the hopelessness that torture visits upon them is maybe even worse. I mean, I'm not a victim, I can't speak for them, but that's what I would guess. Um, and so I think labeling it with torture just puts it on the radar in a much more real way for people than gender-based violence ever would, especially things like marital rape, where, I mean, there are severe cultural frames on, in various countries, they're different, but, if you look at that as torture rather than as kind of, um, intramarital relations or a side effect of intermarital relations, I think it's just a more powerful frame, right? And as someone who's interested in surveys, right? I mean, I know that frames matter. How you ask people things matters. If I ask people, is torture okay, yes or no? And if I ask people, is torture okay to get information from, terrorists to, save a city, I'm going to get different answers, right? If I use torture, if I use this kind of, clean frame. And there's all kinds of frames that you can use. So, as someone who believes in the power of framing, I think framing violence as torture just makes it more accessible to people and kind of highlights the importance of the issue. So it's PR, I guess, to some extent.
Do you think the American legal system views gender-based violence as torture?
Yeah, and actually, I think it does a better job at the state level than at the federal level of doing so. I always tell people, I'm like, if you want to know something about torture in America, Google News, go to Google News and do torture United States. And most of it will come up kind of like intrafamilial violence, or family violence, as the social psychologists call it, right? It'll come up as intramarital violence. States have torture statutes, not all of them, but most of them. I think they all do for animals, but they don't all do for people, if I remember correctly. Like they all have a statute like you can't torture animals, but I think there's a couple that don't have for people, but most of them do. And these acts, come under torture, or they'll say ill treatment or cruelty, right? But yeah. I mean, the U.S. legal system does address it as such, and I think better on the state level than it does at the federal level.
And then I want to ask, for someone like me who isn't in your torture class, who hasn't had a lot of conversations about torture, well, firstly, what is torture? One, but two, is this a word that we should use more often? I think torture, the word torture has like a status, like it's
Yeah.
this grand term, like this is torture. And I think I've never heard someone use it as loosely as you do. So, I mean, what really is torture? But then also, is it something that we should be using in our everyday life when we
Well, I would make one corrective. I wouldn't say use it loosely. I would say use it a lot. Um, because when I use it, I have a definite conception in mind of what it is and the scenarios in which, qualify as such. I use it a lot because it's just something I spend a lot of time on. Not torturing, but, thinking about it. But you have to ask my children about that. I torture, is severe mental, physical degradation of human dignity. Right? I mean, it can be psychological torture, it can be physical. Oftentimes it's both at the same time. One thing we know about torture is that you don't usually get tortured by one method. Usually it's different things in combination, right? So it is an abstract definition, right? Severe, what does that mean? Degradation of human dignity, what does that mean? But that's all of human rights. Like if you get into anything about human rights, it's all very abstract. You know, and we have treaties and we've got treaty committees that, you know, define or make important signposts about what treaties mean to help us understand these abstract terms, right? You know, and I think torture, there's not a master list, right? But the Committee Against Torture has in its deliberations come up with a lot of things that they have said qualifies as torture, or at least as cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, right? And some things that are cruel and inhuman may amount to torture if in combination with other things. So it is a bit of an abstract thing, right? And you don't want to kind of go around crying wolf and calling everything torture, right? You know, some people look at the difference between kind of lesser things in torture as being intent, right? That it's not necessarily the particular thing you do, but that your intent was to severely degrade, you know, human dignity, right? And so, you know, whether it is you're manipulating a clock because you want to throw someone's, you know, internal, you know, clock off, which really, you know, messes with them physically and mentally, or, you know, you're doing something really, really terrible, like, you know, a reading that we have this week in torture, you know, the Syrians were stripping people naked and putting them in front of an air conditioner for 10 days, not letting them sleep, pouring water over them, and they would, you know, shiver so bad their teeth would break. You know, so that's extreme, right? I would say that's an extreme method, right? And a very creative, you know, method. You know, if you will. But, you know, other people think about severity, although I think that's a minority view. The European Court of Human Rights, the Strasbourg Court, has said severity rather than intent. But typically it's intent, right? So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say use it loosely, but you know, I think if you really kind of, you know, want to degrade someone, you know, it can arise to torture. And I think, you know, in ways that maybe people don't think about, you know.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. Yeah, well,
Also thank you for the correction. I did misspeak. I
no,
want to
it's all right, because we need to be careful not to throw stuff around too much, right? Like I said, you don't want to be crying wolf, right? Because if you know, like they say, like, oh, you know, once you get a hammer, every problem's a nail, right? I mean, like, if you overuse something, then it loses its power, right? I mean, and that's like the thing with torture as well. If everything's torture, then nothing is, right? It just is, you know, I mean, you know, maybe it's me with my hammer, but like, you know, I just think a lot more qualifies as such than we commonly imagine.
I want to shift for a second. I want to see how torture. So to preface, Yola mentioned that you had a job in a prison where you were a therapist or something along those lines within that prison.
I did art therapy at a state institution that housed, let's say, people with severe mental incapacity
Gotcha.
and some dangerous people.
And I would love to, if you're willing to share a little bit more about that experience, what you learned and how that has impacted you today.
I learned that when you call for a job from the newspaper, you never know what you're going to get. You know, I was a college student. It was summer. I needed a summer job. You know, back in those days, you looked in the back of the newspaper, they had the want ads, and there was a place that wasn't far from my house that was advertising a really high hourly wage, but they didn't really say a lot about what it was, you know? And so I'm like, that money looks good. I'm going to call them, you know? And so I called them and I went there and I was like, huh, this place has gates. Like, you know, this place is interesting. What is this? And it had all kinds of uh I'm looking for the right word. the people who were there were of all kinds. I didn't want to call them like internees, or they weren't prisoners really, I don't think, or but you know, I think we called them clients. But you know, I worked in an art therapy center called the Adaptive Learning Center. And they did, you know, you do like kind of painting of different kinds and crafts, and there was like a puppet lab, and there was also kind of a workshop that they have at places like ARC, where they would like package things, you know, and then they would go out, like they package, you know, like birthday hats and napkins into the thing like you'd see at a store, right? You know, so they had kind of different levels of people, and they had some people there who were just wards of the state, you know, like maybe they had had a stroke and their family just dumped them,
Mm.
right? But we also had people who had committed heinous crimes and were there because they were, you know, they were sick, and uh, you would go to their cottage, as they call it, because they weren't allowed to kind of come to your central place. You know, and they had people there who killed people, you know, and they saw things, you know, maybe they were schizophrenic, I don't know. You know, I'm not qualified really to make that distinction, and we weren't told, or I wasn't told, you know, because I was a summer guy for a couple summers. But you know, it was really scary, because they had, you know, huge dudes who would work there and would be like their minders, and they would say, okay, don't get within 5 feet of this dude, right? Or don't do this, this sets him off, or don't, you know, don't do that, that sets them off. And even some of the higher level people we had, like there was one guy who would never say anything, um, and every once in a while he would just punch out a window. You know, you know, so you never knew kind of what you were getting. And it was kind of an environment of constant threat in those places. You really had to watch yourself. And you know, I grew up in the country as a pretty naive kid. You know, as a '70s kid, it's like out of Stranger Things. Like I lived on my bike, you know, and like did stupid things with my friends, and you know, I was just the average college student. And I went there and I'm like, wow, okay, this is like the first really serious place I've been to, right? And when you're around that much craziness is the wrong word. I mean, just that much like mental diversity, like, you know, like people seeing things and breaking things and just having the potential to kill you. And it's like, oh, this is a guy who lit his house on fire and used his mother. And like, you know, the one guy, I think I told Yola's class this, the one guy would always tell me he was going to kill my mother on Easter. It's like, David, I'm going to knife your mother on Easter. On Easter, I'm going to come to your house. I'm going to knife your mother, right? Like, it's like, wow, you know, okay, this is a whole different way of being. Um, it was really cool. I mean, on one hand, because the artwork that a lot of them did was just really awesome. Like we hung shows at some big insurance companies and things, like they did some seriously cool artwork. But dealing with their kind of mental condition was really scary. It certainly changed me in terms of like what is out there in the world. You know, my view of what is out there in the world was blown wide open. Because again, I had never been exposed to that kind of like neurodiversity, I guess we would call it now, right? Um, and yeah, it made me, I don't know how, it made me different. Like I spent 2 summers there, and I was a different, not jaded, but a very different person walking out of there. Like my view of what is normal was changed for forever, you know. And I think, and maybe that was helpful for my human rights path, right? Because I mean, if you're going to do human rights work, you have to be accepting of diversity. I mean, that's one of the preconditions, I think, right? And just understanding like what kind of diversity is out there, and also just being a person, understanding like what kind of people are possibly out there, right? It made me a little more cautious, I think, like not paranoid, but you know, because some of these people that were in there seemed normal until they weren't, you know. Yeah, it really had a big impact on me in terms of like what the world has to offer out there, you know. you can't walk away, I think, without being changed. And I think there probably was like, I'd imagine there was probably a high turnover rate for burnout for people working there due to the stress and stuff. But it was kind of, I actually organized the first music festival for all those folks, right? I this is a typical summer kid, right? I'm like, these people need a music festival. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. I'm like, we're gonna call it Summer Wipeout, right? And I'm gonna put a band together and we're gonna play, and we're gonna get some other people to play, and we'll bring out some of the puppets, and we'll have like barbecue and stuff like this. And I had no idea of the security concerns or anything else, or like, but I'm like, we're gonna do this, and we did it. And it was really it was it was one of the most interesting gigs I've ever played. I played a lot. And but they had an awesome time. The people there, clients, they had never had a music festival before, and they loved it. They were the best crowd ever. So that was like the best part of it. But yeah, it was an interesting experience, and I think I brought all this up because when I was talking to Yola's class, there were methods that they would use back at that time to control people physically that I think would probably not be acceptable now. I mean, they're perfectly acceptable then, but it gave me an idea of like how standards change, right? I think now there's no rolling people up in mats and things like that, but at the time, that's what people did, right? So I think there's a greater kind of understanding of, appropriate level measures of control. I don't know what they do now, or if it's better, for worse, but I think that's changed quite a bit.
You mentioned something about how, yeah, you're a changed person in one way or another coming out of that, and also
A little
how
weirder, yeah.
how it probably like impacted you in terms of like burnout. And I
Yeah.
think it's something that we're very curious about, especially because doing this type of work, yeah, you can be like desensitized to it, but also you just kind of see it everywhere. Like you can't just like turn it off and stop seeing it once. And I've noticed even with the torture class that we're on, every time I'm watching a movie or a show now, I'm like emailing you saying, "Oh, I think you should watch this. I'm curious to see what you think of it." And before I might have seen the same episode because I rewatch a lot of TV and now have thought of it in that lens. And now I'm like, oh my God, wait, this is so much more layered than I initially had thought. And you
Yeah.
mentioned that at the beginning of the class, saying that, well, once you start being exposed to this, you're going to start seeing torture a lot more in different areas because there's so much power in that knowledge and understanding and the labeling, as you mentioned. So, in terms of like the burnout, this is something that I believe to be very common when you are doing this type of work. I do
Mhm.
feel it myself.
Yeah.
And so just kind of wondering like what has helped you like go like through that? How do you, when you are feeling super burned out, how do you just kind of get yourself to still show up and continue doing this type of work and learning more, knowing that it's going to be so difficult?
Yeah. I mean, so there are weeks when I do this where like I don't want to come to class. Like I just like, I'm having a day where like I don't want to wrestle with torture today.
Me
I just don't want to do this. I think, the class part of it, I mean, the reason for that is easy. It's just professionalism, right? I mean, like students pay a lot of money for classes and they want a certain amount. They want quality experience for that money, right? I mean, I was a student, like I said, I finished paying off my student loans when I was like 44 or 45, right? So I understand, and so I have a responsibility on my end to be a professional that provides, right, what I'm supposed to provide as an experience for the students in my courses, that I take super seriously, having, been a student myself, like, right? So, I mean, there's that. So that pushes you through, right? Just the professional responsibility. Um, you know, I will say, I've had my time with some bourbon to get me through, maybe more, than one should have. And I say that seriously. Like, people think of like what it is that gets them through the worst times, right? And you kind of try things and say like, well, that was a mistake, right? Meditation is a big go-to for me now. It's a lot healthier for you than the bourbon. In the long run, I think just knowing when to walk away, like, for example, like, I usually on Tuesdays, I do the reading for our class on Thursday. I've read them all before, but I reread everything before class, right? And, I was doing the readings for this week, and at one point I just said, nope, I'm done. I've had enough. Like, I'm starting to feel numb. I'm starting to feel, you know, like I don't want to do this anymore. And I get up and I walk away, right? I go play guitar, which is like my go-to addiction in life, right? So, or I'll just go, I don't know, I'll go look at like some garbage on the net, or something like that, or I'll watch a YouTube video. Um, there's a guy who interviews like music producers and stuff like that and engineers I like to watch, like just knowing when to walk away, right? And just knowing that you need a break, right? And it's kind of like, what they tell athletes, like, your body will tell you when you've had like when you need to stop or whatever. It's like, well, my mind tells me that I've had enough because I know from the past, and this comes from coding human rights violations for data for so long that you're not going to retain things when you've secondarily traumatized yourself. You're not going to do a good job of whatever you're going to do, so you might as well just stop and move on to the next thing because you're just in some sort of like trance of not being well. So it's not only kind of for self-protection, but it's just silly to keep going. Like there's no prize for like being able to say like, yeah, I read all that without stopping. I'm tough. And that goes back to the GBV thing, right? I mean, like what kind of like notion, for me of masculinity is that of like, yeah, I'm a man. I can read all this stuff and I'm not gonna be bothered by this at all. I always tell my undergrad classes, some of you are gonna sit there and you're gonna be like, yeah, it's gonna bother me, and you'll say it in class and stuff like that. And then I'm gonna see you at office hours and you're gonna be crying. I said, and I that's fine, and that's awesome, and I cry too, like, but I'm just telling you that's for a lot of you, that's how it's gonna go, and it's true. Um, I've had people who've left class crying and not come back. It's just not right for them, right? But I mean, I don't see it as any different than like for example, I think what going through torture and studying it and things like that is a heck of a lot better thing than being like a pediatric oncologist. I could not do that. Like, children with cancer, I could not like, and I know they heal a lot of them, like they have the upside, and with studying torture, you never have the upside because you can't change anything, right? It's like being Marley's ghost in A Christmas Carol, right? You want to affect the misery in the world, but you've lost your opportunity. You can't do it anymore. So you just watch it and you wail because there's nothing you can do about it, right? Like I get like, medical professionals have the potential to do good, but for me, that would be, I couldn't do that, no way could I deal with that. The children, bad things happening to children is completely my kind of, I can't deal with this zone.
Yeah.
So I've tried various things, but I think knowing when to walk away and listening to my emotions is, the best way. And as I tell students, it's a little different for everybody, right? And there's no shame. If you can only read for 45 minutes before you need to walk away, that's all right. That's just who you are, and God bless you for feeling it, because quite frankly, like, if you don't feel it, you should not be doing it, right? Like if you read about torture and it doesn't bother you, that sends a signal to me that something's wrong. Like maybe you shouldn't be doing this, maybe like, this is not meant to be like a how-to, like, so I think that if you're not feeling it, something's wrong. So I'm glad for people who like, I'm not happy that they feel traumatized but I'm happy that they have like a conscience and this really horrifies them because I think they're probably better people than me.
I think that's a really good point. I wanted to ask Yola, have you had this similar experience with these readings? Have they been something you had to walk away from?
Well, yeah, I mean, yesterday, yeah, I was reading stuff about the Syria torture in Syria, and I got up and I went and I emptied the dishwasher because that's what I needed to do. I mean, the other thing is like, I get to the point where like I haven't listened. I used to be a big NPR listener. I don't listen to it anymore because they'll have stories sometimes about it, and I just don't want to hear it. I listen to sports radio exclusively, like Philadelphia sports radio, like because there's no news that's not like Phillies or Eagles, like it's it, and like it's a safe space, right? And like I just don't want to hear the politics. I don't hear anything that could do with what it's and that's probably the opposite of a lot of academics. I mean, they want to hear all this stuff, and I'm like, the news on torture always seems to find me. Like I don't need to go out of my way looking for it. So, like, yeah, I get up, turn on 94 WIP, and I unload the dishwasher, and then like, okay, maybe have a snack that's not good for me, like Mounds Bar or something like that, some other addiction, and like go back to it. But yeah, and like I said, I'd be scared. Like, and I think I've said this too to class, like when I no longer, feel bothered by the material, I'm done. That's when I know it's time to not do this anymore, and it's the same thing you do with gender violence, right? Like if you can read about what happens to people because of their gender identity and not be bothered by that, it's time to do something else. It should bother you if you think that it's wrong. Um, you know, um, and I don't know, maybe people have a different opinion about it, but that's kind of in my life where I've landed, so I'm glad it feels icky and not happy that it feels icky at the same time, but that's human rights work.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I do the readings on Tuesday. And I think that's so interesting that you've done that because Anthony, you don't know this, but we have an assignment due Wednesday afternoon, but we don't have class till Thursday. So for the assignment, you need to do some of the reading. You don't have to do all of it, but for Thursday, you need to do all of it. So then I think that's so nicely done. At first, I questioned it and I was like, why do I have to do this work for Wednesday when I don't even have class till Thursday? And then now I'm like, wait, this makes so much sense because I cannot do all of the reading in one day for it. Like I can get through as much as I can, and then I genuinely have to walk away and just do something that has nothing to do with schoolwork because I've realized that for me, it's not more so that I become numb to it, is that I'm trying to speed through it. I get to a certain point where I'm like, okay, I'm tapped out with this, but I just want to do it. So let me just like, and then I will try to just speed through it. And then I still feel like just as triggered and it's not helping. And then I'm not retaining anything because I'm just so in my own head thinking about what I read maybe the previous page.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm like, okay, this is neither productive or helpful or anything. This is just a waste of time because I'll have to go back and reread this in order to retain it. So it's kind of similar. I will not empty the dishwasher as my, go-to, but to each their own. I will go like on a walk or something. And yeah, I think that's a cool part about the class is that I think the way that you set it up was, I don't know if you did it intentionally, but I thought
You
it
need a
was,
recovery period. I
yeah,
did it as a recovery period, right?
yeah.
Like, because I don't want people walking into class fresh from the readings, like feeling like they've just had been, bludgeoned on the head by this awfulness, right? Like, let it wear off for 24 hours, like, and also I think too, like, I'm not an exceptionally quick question asker, right? Like, I'm someone who's best, like, given some material and now I'll get back to you, right? I want to think about it for a while. I'm a slow formulator of questions. Um, but so I think also it gives people some room to kind of ruminate about stuff. Let it percolate a little bit, like steep in what you've read. And even if you're not thinking of it actively, I think people's minds still are working on it in the back somewhere. So yeah, it's a recovery time. It's a time to kind of let it percolate in the background. And I'm glad to hear that it works for you. Because not all choices work, right?
Right.
I also loved the point about putting on sports radio. Yola knows I'm like I watch and listen to sports all day. And with the exception of Yola in the past 3 days, where she's like now getting into basketball, I have not met anyone who is super interested in gender-based violence and is also super interested in sports. So this is like a revelation. I
Yeah,
finally
well,
who can do both.
yeah, right. I mean, it's there's no reason you can't do both, right? I mean, you know, I, yeah. I mean, Philadelphia Phillies are a religion for
Yeah.
me, you know, and
I
you
am
know,
with the
I'm
Ravens, Baltimore Ravens.
Baltimore Ravens. All right. Well, I'm a Steelers fan, so I can't agree
Oof,
there. But
that's
but like, you know, I mean, for me, like sports, it's refreshing, right? I mean, like it has outcomes that are you don't know. Like when you start, anything can happen on most days, right? It's exciting. Like you know, Mondays basketball, women's basketball, both those games. What a showcase for women's basketball that was. It was awesome, you know. And I don't know, it's just a real. It's a space where I can kind of watch that and not think about any terrible stuff,
yeah,
you know. Like, yeah, I guess if you're like, you could think about the exploitation of the NCAA getting rich on all these college athletes, right? But,
and I
you know,
do.
I think that, you know, one thing we talk about one thing you talk about when you're interested in human rights, right? Once you see human rights violations, you see them everywhere, right? You know, you can't swing a, you know, an umbrella and not run into a human rights violation. But I think you have to kind of, at some point to survive, you have to not be able to take on every cause, right? Like, and so for me, it's like, yes, I mean, I think the NCAA is like evilly exploitive. But that's not my fight. You know, I have my own fights and I'm going to enjoy, I recognize that that's an issue, but I'm going to enjoy the game, you know. Same thing with any other kind of thing, like, you know, my students might work on something like I've got a dissertation student working on human trafficking and like, oh, that's terrible. It's awful, you know, but it's not my fight. So I can read her material without being like as emotionally invested in it as I am about my GBV stuff or the torture stuff. But yeah, yes to sports. It's
Yeah, yeah.
awesome.
That's an awesome skill to have. Yeah.
Compartmentalization.
Mm.
Yeah, it's healthy, right? You know, and again, I think for people to do human rights, you have to be able to compartmentalize a little bit, or you'll run into compassion fatigue.
Mhm.
You know, and that's no good. Yola's eyes are really big. Is that something you got?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah,
well,
something like that.
watch out for that.
Yeah. Well, that's like that brings us to like kind of our last question that we had, and then if you have any questions for us, feel free to ask. But like, what's the best advice that you would give to someone that's just now starting to work or like face GBV in their life, or just kind of trying to combine the two? Because a lot of people that do come to GBV, not all of them, but a lot of them have some sort of experience or have been impacted in one way or another. What is like one advice that you would want to give them that maybe you didn't have when you started off?
I'll give two. Listen
Okay.
to the victims and take care of yourself. You
Mm.
know, I mean, I think I went into it. Well, I went into it completely naive, right? And I think I went into it. I think I was guilty of really essentializing women's experiences when I started. You know, I really kind of like looked at like, oh, there's a group called victims, and this is what they're like, right? And I think over time I listened to learn for the particular, or to listen for the particular, right? And understanding like, and granted, like there's a lot more emphasis put on intersectionality, you know, and intersectional identities today than there was 20 years ago, right? I mean, sure, yes. I mean, there were people talking about it, but it wasn't as well known and understood an important thing as it is now. So I think that kind of, you know, had I, you know, really kind of went from the bottom up and really like went to talk to victims, interviewed victims from the start rather than looking at the structure and then deciding to look at women's, like talk to women's victims. I think I would have understood more about how complicated the dynamics of the abuse are and how complicated the way that victims deal with that abuse is. So listen to the victims. And the other one, like we said, take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to help anybody else. And I know that's a truism, and you could put that on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt, but you know, some of those things are true for a reason. And I think that one is, you know, like, you don't get a badge for being a hero, right? And you're not a hero because you can suck up more awfulness than somebody else. You know, you're just a black hole then, you know, and they don't do anybody any good, as far as I know. Maybe we'll discover that they're like the vacuum cleaner of the universe, and they do a service, but like, you know, but yeah, listen to the victims and take care of yourself.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you guys. It's been a really interesting chat. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much.
And yeah, send me the link for it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I'll see you on class Thursday.
All right, I'll see you in class
Thank you so
Thursday.
much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Anthony.
Nice to meet you
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.